Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody. I am not Adam Russo. I pulled the short straw. I'm actually hosting today. I am your Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the FIA Group, Ron E. Peck. Say hello, Ron. Hello, Ron. You know, I don't know why I have to introduce myself like that. I don't think anyone else would want to be me. But again, I'm just clarifying that I am who I am, and it's who I want to be. One person I don't want to be is the person sitting next to me, just because I feel like those shoes are too big to fill. Don't take it the wrong way, buddy. It is a voice. I was going to say face you haven't seen in a while, but this is radio. It's podcast radio. What would you call it?
I guess it's some sort of radio.
It's like audio radio recording.
It's audio.
Something. Yeah. Well, the one thing I know it's not is video, so nobody can see your gorgeous facade. But I will say one thing that people do enjoy when they tune in, Brady Bizarro, is your melodious voice. So why don't you go ahead and say hello, Brady?
Hello, Brady.
I'm going to let it slide. You know, it kills me, man. When I did the whole hello, Ron thing, you know, I thought I was so clever. And then people like Jen McCormick, you know, they respect my intellectual property. And when Adam tells them to say hello, Jen, she refuses and she just says hello. And we let it slide. But anybody else, they don't do it. And he gets mad at them.
He does.
It kind of puts them between a rock and a hard place, right? It's either you don't say hello, fill in the blank name, and Adam gets angry, or you do say it, you, Brady, you say it, and I'm going to sue you for infringing on my intellectual property. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place.
I guess I'm just counting on you not actually, following through with those threats to
Well,
sue
you know,
anyone.
even if I have the right to do so, I don't know what the damages
It's
are going
expensive
to be.
to do that.
You know, I mean, if you pay for lunch, I'm going to end up owing you. So,
Right.
And also, again, it behooves me to introduce the ultimate podcast producer, Pat, the triple P, triple threat, Pat the Man Santos at the controller's desk. What's up, Pat?
Do I say hello, Pat?
Whoa, you blew me away, buddy. Moving on. This is a great time to be alive. Now, I've got a feeling that nobody who is alive is ever going to say this is a terrible time to be alive, because the other option is probably worse. But I'm going to say, objectively speaking, this is a great time to be alive, particularly in our industry. You know why that is?
Why is that, Ron?
I don't want to be bored, Brady. Anyone who knows me, or at least knows that I've worked at this company for more than 13 years, knows that I am a man who does not like to be bored. And right now, when I turn on that television and I look at all of the dogs in this fight, the fight for presidential candidacy, I'm not going to say that it's the Democratic nomination, because there are a few who are throwing their hat into the ring for the Republican candidacy. I mean, can you believe this? It is an all-out battle royale, 50 competitors in the ring, tossing each other into barbed wire and whacking each other with chairs. Have you ever been this entertained, Brady?
I have not.
I knew you wouldn't.
I have
be.
not.
And nobody has been following the action quite as close as you. Is that a fair thing to say?
Almost no one. I think some of the pundits on Meet the Press maybe, but
I don't. I've watched them on television, and they don't know half of what you've talked about. Today's topic for our Empowering Plans podcast by the FIA Group. You know, Pat, I feel like we use a lot of P words now that I think about it. You know, there's a lot of P punctuation in our podcast. But anyway, let's get back to the politics, Brady. We are going to talk a little bit about some of the political upheaval that we're noticing in the industry, some of the things that we see going on in the courts, in the lawmakers' chambers, in D.C. and the state. And one other thing that we want to talk a little bit about, and something we're going to be following as the days come, I believe our next webinar in September is actually going to cover this, assuming this podcast goes out before the webinar. If this podcast is being produced and posted after the webinar, please check out the website, www.fiagroup.com, at the media, and check out the webinar, which should be recorded and posted. So either make sure you sign up or go on and download it. But we're going to be talking a little bit about the different frontrunners, their plans for healthcare, and how we see it impacting what our plans need to do. Because as you know, August, September, October, this is when renewals are happening. This is when the brokers and the TPAs are basically saying to these employers, hey, look, here's what we're going to change. Here's what we're going to keep the same. Here's what we're going to pay for. Here's what we're going to cut. How can you make those kinds of decisions, Brady, now when you don't know what the future holds? That's a complicated situation that we're put in anytime this time of year rolls around in a year of big elections. And so we're going to do the best we can to talk about the different candidates, what their positions are, and how it would potentially impact our clients so that they can at least try to make some educated decisions during renewal. But let's go ahead and actually get that conversation started today. Where do you want to start, Brady?
Well, you mentioned before, Ron, the number of candidates. And I think it's interesting because in 2016, a lot of the late night comedy hosts had fun with sort of the size of the field that was running. It was like they, struggled to get all the graphics on the screen of people that were running. And it just was kind of crazy. This time around, though, you have even more. So as you said, there are some Republicans running as well. I think you have the ex-governor of Massachusetts running, Bill Weld, and a couple other, Mark Stanford, random Republican congressmen who are sort of challenging Trump on the primary level, and they're not going to, of course, succeed. But then you have like 22 Democratic candidates, and each one of them, of course, needs to have a comprehensive policy proposal for every major area of public policy. And I think what a lot of them have found out is that it's very difficult to do that and to stand out from the crowd. But what we've seen emerge is these sort of three different camps, right? In healthcare, at least. And that's the way the conversation has shifted. Where do you stand as a Democrat is sort of the litmus test. So on the one camp, you have the Medicare for All crowd, and we'll talk about that more in the webinar, or we already will have talked about it on the webinar, about what exactly that means, because there's different variations of that. Then you have the people who are calling for sort of just a public option addition to the ACA. So they don't want to go as far as the others on the left and say Medicare for everyone, single payer, but they do want to say have a single payer option. And then on the right, I would say, would be those who are just calling for an ACA 2.0. So obviously the Joe Bidens of the world and a few of the more moderate, lesser known candidates who are running this cycle. So I think it's interesting, though, for us to follow this because obviously it's not a foregone conclusion that the president now will win or not in 2020. But either way, this is the way the conversation shifted, that we're talking now a lot more about a significant disruption to healthcare, right? And that's a big deal because I think whether it happens in 2020 or in 2022, if there's, in a midterm election or something, whenever the Democrats regain control, and at some point they will, I think it's just important for us to understand that the conversation has significantly shifted toward a single payer type program. And that is a big, big change in what was happening even 3-4 years ago.
It's wild because as you're talking about it, Brady, and you mentioned disruption, it's so wild to think that when we are describing the candidates, the Obamacare candidates are the conservative ones. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's been a decade, but if you think about it, I remember when the ACA was being passed in its rookie year, and everybody in our industry was thinking the world's come to an end. They've really pulled out all the stops, and now all of a sudden it's a wild west, and healthcare and health insurance in particular is being hyper-regulated, and it's the end of the world. How could these liberals have gone in and basically taken government control of what should be private business? And there was so much pushback. And cut to today, and the people who are still in support of the ACA, frankly, they want to do even more with it. And that's on the spectrum of liberal to conservative. They're on the conservative side. It really shows you how far, or I don't know if far is the right word, depending on what your political stance is, but just the distance that we've gone towards the left, where what once was left is now center, at least in the Democratic Party and healthcare in particular.
Yeah, and so, Ron, that actually came up when I was in Texas recently for a conference at the Texas Association of Benefit Administrators, also called TABA. And after my presentation, I was talking to some people in the crowd, and they were asking basically the question you just asked or the comment you just made about how we ended up here. And a lot of what we talked about there, and I think this is true nationwide in terms of people who are paying attention, is that the ACA didn't fix all the problems that it set out to fix, right? Any significant major overhaul of the healthcare system would typically aim to fix the issues of access, cost, and quality, right? Those are the three sort of areas that you're trying to fix legislatively or policy-wise. And really, the ACA didn't really address all of those sufficiently. In some cases, it didn't even address any at all, arguably, like maybe price. And so I think what we talked about is like, look, we're moving to the left here because the system is just not solving the problem of extremely high prices and lack of transparency, and where you have quality outcomes not necessarily matching the price involved. And so basically, it's a failure of the system that you're having all of these sort of outlier events happen where people are being pulled in different directions. And I feel like that's why we're in a situation now where the ACA is sort of like the unpopular position to have in the Democratic Party, where 10 years ago it was the only position to have, because it didn't actually pan out the way people thought it would, and it hasn't solved many of the problems that I think people hoped it would. And this time around, I think what you're seeing calls for is just sort of blow up the system, right? Cancel all the medical debt out there, put everyone in a single payer. Those are, take away people's private insurance. Those are extreme measures, but I feel like they make sense to see those kinds of measures being proposed if you understand from a consumer perspective that, look, your prices are going up, things aren't changing, things aren't getting better, something's got to give.
So it's interesting because you mentioned the goal of the ACA or Obamacare, right, was access, quality, and price control, right? And what's interesting, and I think the reason why there's so much angst about it, is because it was presented as, we're going to create access to healthcare. We're going to improve quality of healthcare, and we're going to reduce the price, the cost of healthcare. And if you look at that on its face, you would say it failed. However, if I take the word healthcare and replace it with the word health insurance, I think people would agree that it actually accomplished that mission, right? Did they create more access to health insurance? Of course, right? Just look at the pre-existing conditions alone, okay, and affordability of health insurance. So more people have access to more health insurance. Did it reduce the price of health insurance? Some would argue, sure, right? I can sign up now for a bronze plan. There's a lot of, these bare bones, right, minimum essential coverage plans where maybe the only insurance I could have purchased was priced so high that the only other option was not to have it at all. So certainly these policies or plans of insurance are more expensive than not having it at all.
Right.
But it's still cheaper than the only insurance I could have purchased pre-ACA.
Cheaper for the consumer too.
Correct.
Though, right?
Correct. And then quality, right? Again, I guess it's arguable. I would say that if your only other option was not to have insurance at all, even bare bones insurance might be better than that. So from a quality standpoint, but also there's a lot of requirements. There's requisite coverage. There's benefits that must be covered by these plans that maybe in the past they were able to exclude. So you could argue that it improved the quality of health insurance as well. So if you view the ACA as a law strictly addressing health insurance and not health care, mission accomplished, right? The problem is that for those out there that thought by making health insurance more accessible, less costly, and better quality, it was somehow going to fix healthcare.
Yeah, no.
You're very mistaken, because as we know, health insurance is just another means by which you pay for healthcare. It doesn't actually fix the cost of healthcare itself. It just kicks the can, because whether I'm paying more out of pocket up front or paying more in premiums and contributions a year from now because my awesome health insurance is paying ridiculous bills, I'm still ultimately the one paying for it, because as we know, money doesn't grow on trees.
So maybe, Ron, you would have been in favor of a different acronym. Instead of the ACA, maybe the AIA, the Affordable Insurance Act.
I think a little bit more honesty and transparency would have gone a long way, and I think we'd be in a position now where people would stop fooling themselves. Again, I mean, if you want to reduce the cost of healthcare, you know how you do that? By reducing the cost of healthcare. Now, how you do that, that's what's up for conversation. Do you just force a provider to take less? I mean, I guess, right? That's one way of doing it. But I'll tell you right now, more of my friends in my real life are doctors and hospital administrators and in healthcare than they are in law. And if they hear me saying like, just take less money, again, they're not going to be too happy with me. So that may not be the solution or the only solution, but you have to at least address first the fact that healthcare is expensive. And just deciding who's going to pay for it instead of asking, why am I paying this much? You're not going to get anything done. So what are we currently seeing, Brady, that you think is going to be relevant to the conversation, whether it's in the court or Congress?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, as we're on the topic of the ACA, is, of course, the fate of the ACA. What happens to it in the midst of this court battle that's been ongoing now for over a year? And at this point, we're in early September, and a lot of the political pundits and legal analysts think that the case, which is currently in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, will be decided by that appellate court sometime next month. That's because October is the month where the Supreme Court starts its new session, and the case has really been with this Fifth Circuit for a couple months now. Oral arguments were held in July, and everyone wants to know what's going to happen with this case. How are they likely to rule? And if you paid attention to the oral arguments like I did back in July, you would have gleaned a few things from them. And of course, you can't really tell, judges are careful not to tip their hand one way or the other in these arguments. But it sounded to me, first of all, you had 3 judges on this panel. The only judge that was appointed by a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, didn't actually speak at all. So that wasn't really, you couldn't get much, obviously, from that position. But the other 2 really hammered away at those who were defending the ACA and were basically pressing them to say, hey, look, why shouldn't this whole law fall? Now that we have no more individual mandate effectively, why should we not just get rid of the rest of this law? And I think based on the questioning, there's a pretty good chance that they may just in fact do that. What's likely to happen, I think, is you will have a ruling by the Fifth Circuit which says the ACA is unconstitutional because the individual mandate's been zeroed out, and they'll probably stay their own ruling pending an appeal to the Supreme Court, which is likely. That would be a big deal. So I know I'm kind of going out on a limb by saying I think this is what's going to happen, but this particular circuit gets a lot of cases sent its way with a conservative sort of tinge to them. And I think from what I've read, at least, they're not too afraid to make sweeping, decisions. And one way to sort of do that, to have your cake and eat it too, would be to decide something. In this case, the ACA is not constitutional, and then just pend your decision until the Supreme Court will take it up in its new term coming up. So that's, I think, the biggest thing to look for is what's going to happen with the ACA. So what that would mean, by the way, if I'm right, and if this decision comes out and it gets stayed, is that nothing would change with respect to ACA enforcement or the regulations that apply to self-funded plans and fully insured plans for 2020. So nothing with your plan design or cost containment techniques would change per se between now and the end of the year. That's the biggest sort of cliffhanger that's on the docket now. The other few cases that are sort of percolating in the courts have to do with other components of the ACA. So how will the ACA's contraceptive mandate case get decided? You had a situation where you had a new set of rules issued by the Trump administration, which really made it easier for employers to get an exception or an accommodation to the ACA birth control rules. Those rules were tied up in court. Then you had another court case which found the original rules to be unconstitutional. So super confusing. Both of those rulings were put on hold. So we're back to basically following the original rules. Those are expected to be decided this fall as well. So we'll be keeping an eye out for those. But a lot of employers really care about how these cases are decided because either they are paying for contraceptive coverage or their TPA is if they qualify for an accommodation. So someone's paying for them. And if the result of these cases means that they qualify for an exemption, they wouldn't have to pay for this particular service. And they care about, their obligations in that regard. So that's one of the biggest changes. The other one is how courts will deal with drug importation if and when that gets before them. If you recall recently, the latest sort of thing to happen on this front was the FDA sort of quote unquote cracking down on importation back in February and March. But then in the last couple of weeks, the administration announced a plan where it would allow for importation of certain drugs. So it seems like they're shifting away from, what was a more hard line stance earlier this year to perhaps allowing, I think they're calling it a pilot program, where certain drugs will be approved to be imported from Canada, and they're probably going to select certain health plans, probably municipal plans, that will be allowed to start doing this. But, that may send signals that, if you're currently doing drug importation now and you're afraid of getting nabbed, that perhaps the fire's a little less hot right now on that regard. So those are the big issues that we're following here. And of course, what's happening with this balanced billing legislation in Congress right now, right? There were these three options that Congress was mulling over on which one they would pursue, the Senate at least, and they went so far with this plan where I think they chose not to go with the arbitration proposal, instead to go with sort of an out-of-network repricing component, which we don't really know, though, what that's going to be based on. And that's, of course, the million-dollar question is how will they be coming up with these prices? But for now, that bill is still in the Senate. It's not really been kicked out to the full Senate. I think it's actually still in the committee, the Health and Education, Labor and Pensions Committee. That might happen later this fall, too. I know Sai is watching that, and we're watching that. Those are the big things that are on my radar, at least.
So like I said, we're not bored.
No, we're not.
The one thing I want to kind of think about before we say goodbye and remind people that they should either log in for the webinar or download the recorded webinar, depending on when this podcast is posted, Pat, is that the ACA in and of itself, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but how helpful or hurtful it is to the health benefits industry, to employers, I think depends a lot on the cost of the health care. So if effort was made, measures were taken to reduce the actual cost of the healthcare itself, independent of the ACA, then being required to offer benefits to people who previously couldn't get insurance, being required to put a cap on how much you can charge, being required to allocate a certain amount of every premium or contribution to healthcare instead of profit, being required to offer mandatory benefits that you otherwise might have excluded, the things that the ACA is celebrated for providing, those things may not be as difficult to provide or burdensome if the actual cost of healthcare was reduced. The negative impact the ACA has on benefit plans, on insurance carriers, on employers seems to rise or fall depending on how affordable the healthcare that sponsor, that plan, that insurance is required to purchase. So you mentioned, for instance, drug importation. I see these specialty drugs, it's costing millions of dollars to treat one patient. And if I'm required by the law, and I'm not saying this is the case, but let's say hypothetically the law requires me to pay for that, of course I'm going to be bankrupt. But if you can take that $1 million drug and get it to a few $1,000s a year, suddenly being required to pay for it's no longer such a big deal. So I think the law in and of itself, the ACA that is neither good nor bad. I think its quality depends a lot on the cost of healthcare itself. And so I'm curious to see what will be done or not done to actually reduce the cost of healthcare, because I think that as a side effect will either increase or decrease the amount of people who are gunning for the ACA.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I said before, which is I think there's been a failure to address price through these other alternative sort of options you described outside of the ACA. And because we've failed, I think, as an industry and frankly as a country to address the price issue outside the ACA, that's what's driving the politics. That's why you're seeing candidates lean very far to the left saying, look, let's just have a single payer. Let's take, healthcare back from employers and insurers, and we'll just have the government handle it all. Because there's been a failure to address these outstanding problems, and it's really just coming to a head, I think. And I think that's definitely driving the conversation, driving the politics. And I think it's in our interest to highlight and showcase the benefits of employer insurance, particularly self-funded insurance, which you have more flexibility in administering and can help control costs better.
Before we go, the one image I want to leave people with is I remember this was many years ago. I don't want to say exactly how many, but I think I was maybe, 9, 10 years old, right? My younger brother, he's a couple years younger than I. Our uncle, okay, my parents were out, and my uncle came to babysit us. This was the first time ever, and I was very excited because this was my cool uncle, okay? My Uncle Steve. I know you're out there listening, right? And he agreed that he was going to take me and my brother out to see a movie at the theater, which, again, this was before the home theaters with the HD television, surround sound, right? So, this was exciting news that we were going to go see a movie. I even think he was going to buy us popcorn. That's how crazy we're talking. And we get to the theater and realize we hadn't actually picked a film. So my brother and I, we were fighting back and forth about which film to see. I think I wanted to see the animated Transformers cartoon movie. You remember that one? And he wanted to see something
Before
else,
my
right?
time.
I think like Leonard Nimoy or something. Anyway, and we're fighting, and my uncle, he sees us bickering back and forth, and he says, if you guys can't pick a movie, we're going home and we're not seeing a movie at all.
Wow.
And my brother and I, we were convinced that was just an empty threat. And we were still fighting over this. And he, all of a sudden, my uncle, he turns around and says, okay, we're out of here. And we leave. And the reason I tell this story, and again, I didn't make this up, this is a true story, is because when I look at providers and I look at payers, they're like my brother and I, just back and forth bickering over which film we're going to see. And the government's like my uncle. And he's basically saying, look, if you guys can't figure out what you're going to do, then I'm just going to take over. And what I'm going to pick is the worst possible of the three options, right? You're better off seeing the movie your brother wants to see than not seeing a movie at all. So I just feel like right now, the back and forth bickering over balanced billing and excessive charges and fraud, waste, and abuse, these things that, frankly, it feels like a lot of, and not every provider, but a number of the providers we're dealing with are so focused on maximizing profits today, they're not thinking about long-term viability. And if there is a single payer system run by the government, forget getting 150% of Medicare or 200% Medicare, you'll be lucky to get 50% of what Medicare currently pays. Because if there's a single payer, that's a monopoly. They hold all the chips. So again, I'm having difficulty understanding why, from the payer and provider perspective, we can't come to some sort of arrangement that works for everyone. No one will be thrilled with the negotiated rate, but it'll be a heck of a lot better than a single payer system. So with that illustration in mind, I'm going to go ahead and say good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. It was great talking to you. As always, thank you for joining the FIA Group's Empowering Plans podcast. And don't forget to sign up and or download the September webinar when we delve deeper into the political landscape. Thank you so much.
Thank you.